Hi, everybody, and welcome to another lecture. This is going to be lecture 3, and as the title stated, we're going to discuss how courts translate public religious expression into law. I think this is a very interesting topic to discuss because obviously we're going to discuss concepts such as the free exercise and free exercise clause, the establishments clause, and we're going to go over different judicial framings. And I always love to discuss judicial framings because obviously, as we discussed in the first episode or lecture, how judges read the Constitution. And then in lecture 2, we discussed different terms. This is going to be a doctrinal lecture on visible religion and public life, school prayer, neutrality, coercion, and the way courts classify public religious acts before they ever even apply a constitutional test. And so for anyone that really enjoys these topics of religion and the Constitution, I really think you'll enjoy this lecture. And if you have any questions, obviously, please leave them in the comments. I would love to read them. And let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to go over the lecture roadmap first. We're going to start with the text of doctrine. We're going to begin with the religion clauses within the Constitution itself and the translation problem, that basically includes broad constitutional language must become administrable categories such as the free exercise, establishment, neutrality, and coercion principles that apply. Then we're going to go over the public expression framework. Explain how doctrine distinguishes private religious expression in public life from government religious speech, sponsorship, or pressure in settings such as schools. And then we're going to go over narrative conflict at the end, this is very central to this lecture, involves public religious expression cases that often turn on which story the Supreme Court, accepts about persecution, neutrality, pressure, and visible faith. So let's go ahead and back out so you can see this a little bit better on your screen. Show you here. The topics covered in this class today are going to be some of the religion clauses and interdeterminacy, what the text gives, what it leaves open, and why public religious expression creates tension between the free exercise and non-establishment principles, a translation problem, how courts turn broad constitutional language into doctrines about neutrality, coercion, sponsorship, private expression, and institutional role. Then we're going to go over public expression framework, why the same public prayer can look like private devotion, government religious activity, or something ambiguously in between. And then we're going to go over a quick case spine. I've only got 2 cases in this. We're going to discuss Engel v. Vitale and Kennedy v. Bremerton as a changing story about school prayer, personal prayer, and the court's modern approach. And then we're going to discuss narrative and favoritism, how courts validate some stories about persecution or pressure while discounting others, often through seemingly neutral doctrinal labels. And then we're going to connect this all back to equality, which was fundamental to our lecture 2. And this is why, obviously, it says lecture 3 echoes lecture 2, because we're going to discuss the same issues of neutrality, identity, minority status, and doctrinal framing, which reappear in these religious cases. So, from words to doctrine, lecture 1 asked how judges claim to read constitutional language faithfully. Lecture 3 asked what happens when the relevant constitutional language concerns religion in public life. And so let's go ahead and dive into some of these concepts. So the first thing we have to know whenever we're discussing this type of topic with religion in public life is the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So again, just read this very closely again. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And so what we can gather from this is the text really provides for 2 clauses. And as you can see on screen, let's just go ahead and read that. It says 2 clauses, a non-establishment principle and a free exercise guarantee. At a high level, the Constitution protects religion from suppression while also limiting state alignment with religion. And so again, what that's basically saying is this: if we look very closely at this phrase, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That's essentially two different clauses in a single clause. Here's the one single clause. Now, when we're talking about a concept such as no law respecting an establishment of religion, that's what provides for the establishments clause. And then no law prohibiting the free exercise thereof of religion, that's what is the free exercise clause. So from this, we get the establishments clause and the free exercise clause, which are fundamental to public religious expression. So let's go ahead and dive into the next one. So why religion needs translation? Because obviously we have to translate that clause itself. So let's go ahead and pop this up on screen. Judicial necessity. Courts cannot decide public religion disputes from the bare text alone. They need categories such as school prayer, private expression, neutrality, coercion, endorsement, and government speech. And then methodological continuity. This is the same problem from lectures 1 and 2. Broad constitutional words become legal doctrine only through acts of framing, classification, and doctrinal construction. Translation asks when visible religion in public life is private expression, when it is institutional religious activity, and who gets to decide which description governs. And so again, this goes back to some of the different concepts that I discussed in previous episodes. When you have very broad clauses, and you have the challenge for courts is to make these very broad clauses more concrete so that we can apply them to more specific factual scenarios. And obviously, when you read just the language of the free exercise and the establishments clause, let's go ahead and pull this up. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Obviously, that's a very broad concept. And so what we need to do is define, what standards would govern that type of phrase. So let's go ahead and pop on screen a discussion checkpoint and go over some of this. So questions after the opening section. What makes religion public? Is it the key issue of physical visibility, institutional setting, the identity of the speaker, or the audience's susceptibility to pressure? What should doctrine fear most? Suppression of religious expression, subtle state endorsement, or social pressure within schools and other hierarchical institutions? And now we have also a transition question. What doctrinal tools has the court built to stabilize these concerns in actual cases? So let's go ahead and dive into the next section. How doctrine stabilizes meaning. Once broad religious liberty language is translated into doctrine, the legal system acts as though the resulting categories are stable, even when the underlying social meanings remain contested. And again, we discussed this in some of the, especially in lecture 2, when I discussed the term minority. Does it have the meaning of numerical minority, or are we talking about a historically marginalized minority? And those groups can obviously change according to those definitions. So we have these categories. However, the individuals or groups which fit those categories are unstable and constantly subject to change. So it's very important that our law recognize that. So also, jumping into private expression and government religious activity. Private religious expression. Students and citizens may generally pray, wear religious clothing, read scripture, distribute religious materials, and speak openly about faith in public settings, including public schools during appropriate non-instructional time. And then we also have government religious expression. Schools and public officials may not sponsor, organize, or appear to lead religious observance in their official capacities, especially where the setting is compulsory, hierarchical, or directed towards students. And so what we get from that is this. As you can see on screen, we have private religious expression and government religious expression. And so when we're dealing with private religious expression, just to put that very simply in, a common person's language, it's just your own private conduct, right? No government, no state, or anything is influencing that. It's all of your own private expression. However, the government can also express its own views. They can pass laws to further advance certain viewpoints or underlying viewpoints that the government holds. And sometimes those viewpoints can involve religion, especially where there are theocratic governments. So we can also have government religious expression. And clearly, as history would indicate, governments can, coercively provide their own religious, or excuse me, the governments can coercively try to, command what should people believe, what should their private religious expressions believe. And generally, within American law and Western conceptions of law, we believe that it's up to each individual to have, form their own religious beliefs, and that the government really has no business involving itself in those matters for an individual. So let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. We have to ask 3 questions that organize public religious expressions cases. First, who is speaking? A student, a private citizen, a teacher, a coach, a principal, or another actor whose role may blur the line between personal expression and state authority. Where and to whom? A park and a classroom are not the same. Public space, school space, graduation, and athletic events create different assumptions about voluntariness and audience pressure. And then what kind of pressure exists? A court may ask whether the conduct is merely visible, subtly pressuring, formally coercive, or practically unavoidable for a captive or dependent audience. And so what does all this mean? We're going to jump into some of these concepts. When we're talking about who is speaking, what I always want you to remember is whenever we're saying there's private religious expression or government religious expression, whoever is doing the expressing, whoever we state first, let's always identify, is it a private actor or a government actor? And from there, if it's a student, it might be in a private capacity. If it's a teacher, sometimes it might be in a private capacity. However, teachers can also act in their own government capacity as well, because the students themselves, and we're going to discuss this, are compelled to be in school. It's not a voluntary process. If you don't go to school and you're a minor and you don't have a legal exception, you, the student, and the parents could get in trouble for that type of conduct. And then where and to whom, all that really means is, let's always not only be conscious of who is speaking, but let's be aware of the setting. So who is speaking and where is the setting? And then what kind of pressure exists? Obviously, as I previously described, not all settings are people are there voluntarily. They may feel pressured to be there in order to gain access to benefits or to avoid punishment in other settings. And so it's always very mindful to be aware of these different societal pressures that can exist. Let's go ahead and move on to the next slide and just show you that how the court frames religion cases. Well, let's go ahead and pull up. First, we have the free exercise clause, which protects religious practice against targeting and often against exclusion from otherwise available public benefits, spaces, or opportunities. We also have the establishment clause, which still prohibits state-backed religion, but recent doctrine focuses more on coercion and historical practice than on abstract separation alone. And then we have a post-Lemon shift. The court has moved away from Lemon and endorsement language toward history, coercion, and neutrality, making some visible religious practices easier to defend. And so what that means is effectively this. We've already gone over the free exercise clause and the establishments clause as stated in the First Amendment of the Constitution. The free exercise clause provides that you as an American have the right to freely exercise your own religious beliefs and that the government cannot interfere with that. The establishments clause, as we've already discussed, provides that the government is not prohibited to install religion or provide for any type of state-backed religion. And that's very important because in theocratic governments, these are states that are provide for state-backed religion. The state actually passes laws, whether it's in their constitution or their own statutes, and they adopt religious principles and follow them. And then with respect to the Lemon test is a historical test that the government and courts used to define whether the government had improperly was seeking to establish religion. It had its own set of criteria, which involved did it advance such as like a secular purpose. It wasn't advancing religion in any type of particular way. However, in recent doctrine, the Lemon Test seems to no longer apply according to American law, even though it did govern for I think over 50 years, 60 years or so. So for the court to have rescinded that as recently as with 4 years ago, it's been an interesting development in the establishment law practice within American law. And we're going to jump into some of the post-Lemon shift as well in this lecture. So let me see if I can get everything on screen correctly. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So we're going to just discuss, and this is a very broad overview. It can get a lot more specific, but we're going to go over the case spine of public religious expression, which this is the clearest way to see the doctrinal shift, and that is to compare the court's earlier school prayer cases with its modern approach to personal prayer in public school settings. And so let's go ahead and move forward. The classic school prayer baseline. This comes from a case called Engel v. Vitale, as you can see here on screen. Now, this was a case in 1962, and the facts of this case involved the state of New York, which authorized a state-composed prayer for recitation in public schools. Participation was said to be voluntary, but the practice was built into the school's official routine. And again, from what I recall, based on what I saw with this case, was that there was some type of prayer that referenced Almighty God and that it's going to protect the school and the children and the nation, and that all the children would say this prayer, and it was voluntary. But the Supreme Court actually struck that down. And here, as you can see at the bottom, here's the doctrinal lesson from this case, Engel v. Vitale. The court treated this as unconstitutional state religious activity. Even a non-denominational, formally voluntary school prayer was incompatible with the Establishment's Clause. And so, what we get from that is, even though you know what, let's go ahead and move on to the next slide, because it actually is going to give you a better overview than I would just saying it. That's why I wrote this out. Let's go ahead and see why Engel matters, the older logic of the school prayer doctrine. So first, let's focus on the school setting. Public schools are unusual because the audience is young, structured, and often effectively captive, even where attendance at a specific exercise is nominally optional. And what do I mean by that? Again, there are some situations where, if you're at a school setting that, you have to be there. Like I just said previously, if you're a child under the age of 18 and you don't go to school, your parents can get in a lot of trouble, truancy for absence, because you have to go to school. That's just what the law says. And I think all 50 states, actually, unless you have some type of valid legal exception. And so by you being compelled to go to school, if the school then starts compelling you to take religious classes or to understand religion in a particular way, well, that can create conflicts within American law. We also have to evaluate state sponsorship. The problem was not only theology in this case, Engel v. Vitale. It was the government's own role in composing, authorizing, or organizing the religious act. And again, that's very important to be aware of. The government themselves is involved in the script writing of what the prayer would be. And, the school is representative of the government. So effectively, the school is a medium between the government and the people. And so where they're providing for scripts for prayer to be read for all, that is composing, authorizing, or organizing religious acts. And that can be harmful for some people's own private expressions of their own religious beliefs. And so voluntariness was not enough. A prayer can still violate the Establishment Clause even when no one is formally forced to recite it, because institutional pressure may do much of the work. And what do we mean by institutional pressure? It's effectively where the institution, the school, provides for this set of a state scripted prayer, and that if you don't say it, you'll likely face certain repercussions in other aspects of the setting, right? You may lose access to certain benefits, or you may be socially punished in other contexts. And that always must be considered within these compelled settings such as schools. And for purposes of this lecture, I think schools are actually the best illustration of these public forums which we're compelled to go to, and the people that go are young and impressionable. And so, and we're going to also, I'm going to show some videos where actually Iranians that grew up in Iran, where there is a theocracy and a lot of their own governments do cross the line with respect to installing religion in schools, how they say it has affected them. And Iranian Americans are some of the most intelligent and smartest Americans when it comes to explaining these types of, the government involving itself too much in religion and religion involving itself too much in the government, and how that has harmful effects on the society. And that's why we have the First Amendment. So moving on. We also have the modern anchor case. Now let's go ahead and make this bigger on screen. And this is a case called Kennedy v. Bremerton. And Kennedy v. Bremerton was a case decided in 2022 by the Supreme Court. And the facts of this case involved a public school football coach who prayed at midfield after games. Now, he was also in Washington State at the time of doing these prayers. The district restricted the practice out of concern that it could be viewed as unconstitutional school-associated prayer. Now, what had occurred, and we're going to see this a little bit more in the next slide, is we see this a lot in the South. Actually, this was very common at the high school I went to, because I'm from the South too, and we have a lot of religious influence through our teachers and our educators, and they provide a little bit of influence on the school, and the school is representative of the government. And so, and I can see how this would unfold in Washington State. Is what happens is you have these very religious football coaches. And a lot of football coaches are very religious. It gives them a lot of meaning in life, and that's great. I think they should be religious. I'm very happy they are. I want to protect their own religious beliefs. It's just one of the issues, legally speaking, is where it crosses the line of, okay, you are a state actor in terms of being a teacher. However, you also are a private actor, and you have your own personal, individual religious beliefs, and we have to respect both, and that's always very difficult, and it's challenging, quite frankly, for any thinker, because facts and technology and settings are always changing too. So we have to be mindful of that. But yeah, what happened was, after these football games, the football coach would collect all of his players in midfield, and they would pray together. And not only would the coaches be involved, the players would be involved, some of the other students that had come from the crowd would be down there, the parents. And so it was more of a spectacle with everybody. It wasn't just him alone. And we're going to kind of discuss that the conservative majority in this case that sided with the teacher did it somewhat portray it that way, and we're going to discuss that. But I just want to give you an imagery of the kind of the facts that had occurred. And actually, in this case, the holding was that the Supreme Court ruled for the coach, treating the conduct as protected free exercise and free speech, rather than impermissible school-sponsored religious activity. So, two stories about the same conduct. And now this is what I was getting into a second ago. So in this case, we have the majority version, which they describe this case as a brief, quiet, personal prayer by a private individual during a lull in official duties. On this telling, the district appears hostile to ordinary religious expression. And so what we gather from that is this: the conservative majority said that even though the coach, gathered other coaches, other players, other students, parents, all the public who wanted to be there in midfield, this was still brief, quiet, and personal, and still private. And even though they had just played a state school-sanctioned activity game, involving football, American football, post-game, this was a lull in duties. Now, none of this language appears in the Constitution or appears in previous case law. This is actually stuff that the Supreme Court, the conservative majority, just came up with. These new concepts in this case, quiet, personal, brief prayer, and official lull, a lull in official duties. Again, that's never appeared in case law or things of that nature. However, by saying that, it does make the district appear that they were being hostile to ordinary forms of religious expression. Now, as obviously you can see, I'm much more of a critic of that framing, and here's the critic's version. Repeated public prayer by a school coach at midfield in the immediate wake of school events, with students around him and potential pressure built into the hierarchy of the system. And so that's exactly what I'm getting at is, let me just finish reading here at this note at the bottom before I analyze that. The critical insight is that these are not minor factual disagreements. They are rival classifications that steer the whole doctrinal analysis toward free exercise protection on one side and establishment concern on the other. And so what I mean is effectively this, is the way the conservative majority had portrayed this case was to describe Kennedy as, this was just, a brief lull in duties, and this is protected by the free exercise clause. However, the critics of that would say, look, you're still wearing the uniform that you just wore in the game, right? You're probably still, you have the sweat on your body from sweating in the game. It is that contemporaneous with the event that just occurred. So to say that there was this a lull in official duties immediately subsequent to the game, that's just, I'm not so sure that's 100% objectively true. I think that's more of a subjective belief in order to further a certain religious, political, or legal viewpoint. And so, I think it's a bit of a tough scenario, when we're describing that. But hold on, I just want to check and make sure that we're on. Oh, let me pull this slide up for you. So what changed from Engel to Kennedy? From school prayer to personal prayer. Now, mind you as well, Engel was a case decided in 1962, and Kennedy was a case decided in 2022. And so that's a 60-year difference between these cases. So from school prayer to personal prayer. The court increasingly distinguishes official religious exercises from private acts of faith occurring within public institutions. And so here what we have is the public institution of the school, the football team, the football setting. We had a quick, temporary, private act of faith occurring within this more public setting. And so we're able to carve out little private settings inside of the larger public settings. And then we also have from separation to neutrality, which is excluding religious expression is more likely to be described as discrimination or hostility toward religion rather than as a necessary separation. And again, so what we see developing on the majority, which is more of the conservative majority in that Kennedy case, is they say that really any type of prohibition against this and, trying to have abstract separation is more discrimination and hostility towards religion. That's the framing of it. And then we also need to discuss from endorsement to coercion. Recent doctrine asks less whether religion is publicly visible and more whether there is evidence of actual or meaningful coercion. And so here, obviously, according to that analysis, they said, the conservative majority did not find that there was any actual or meaningful coercion. They framed it as more of a private, personal, very short, private expression of religious faith within the broader context of a public setting. So let's do a quick thing of questions after this case spun, and then I want to show you some quick videos regarding, how certain politicians would like religion to be used in schools and why I would have certain critiques of that. But let's go ahead and pop these questions up on screen. What is doing the work? Is the result driven mainly by the free exercise principle, by the court's rejection of Lemon, or by the factual narrative the majority chose to emphasize? And then how much pressure counts? Should law care only about formal coercion or also about social pressure in schools, teams, ceremonies, and unequal institutional relationships. And then we have the transition question. If public religious expression is partly a narrative contest, whose story of pressure or persecution does the court recognize as legally serious? So let's go ahead and pop up some quick videos for us to see, because I think this would do a good job at illustrating some of the political hostilities that come with religion. Now, for a lot of people, religion and politics is difficult to separate. You know, we talk about separation of church and state. Some people think that's possible. Other people think that's impossible. And then two, we also have certain political thinkers that, quite frankly, they may think that's possible, but they just don't want it. And they would rather see certain religious expressions pushed more than other forms of religious expression. So what I want to do is show a couple videos and then provide my thoughts on each video that we can take away from this lecture as a whole. So pop this up on screen. This is Duke University scraps a Muslim call to prayer. Now, this is 11 years ago. Now, before I play this video, I want everybody to know Duke University is a private university. It is not a public university. Generally, private universities, private settings can express themselves in any form of religious way they want. And so if this were public, we could have more serious debates about this, but this is a private setting, and it just goes to show you some of the political blowback that Muslims would see in American society for certain religious expressions. So let's play it.
There was such an uproar when Duke University announced plans to use the chapel tower for the Muslim call to prayer. University officials decided to call it off. Instead, a more subdued observance was held today. Joanna Goldman is there.
It was a peaceful show of solidarity in front of the university's iconic bell tower. The call to prayer didn't ring out from above, but instead came from a loudspeaker on the steps of the chapel. Michael Schoenfeld is Duke's vice president for public affairs.
We were made aware of and have been following serious and credible concerns about personal safety and security.
Administrators and staff were bombarded with threatening emails and expletive-laden calls from people threatening to withhold donations if Duke went forward with its overture to the campus's 700 Muslims. Vitriol flowed from hard-right conservatives, including evangelist Franklin Graham, the son of Billy Graham, who denounced the school on Facebook. Followers of Islam are raping, butchering, and beheading Christians, Jews, and anyone who doesn't submit to their Sharia Islamic law. The post received more than 77,000 likes. Lara Musser-Gritter, a Christian graduate student in the Divinity School, said Graham doesn't speak for her, and one religion should not silence another.
They often pray on Friday mornings in the chapel basement, but that's kind of an invisible place, and I wanted to visibly support them with my presence.
University Imam Adil Zeb, who led the day's prayer service, tempered his disappointment.
Every civil rights struggle takes time, no matter what community has come into America. And this is our time to keep moving forward.
Duke called in extra security for today's gathering. Charlie, members of the Muslim community hope to sit down with administrators to revisit their decision. The school says it's willing to look at the issue.
So what we can gather from that is effectively, look, this is a private university simply having its own, practice with respecting a religious minority on campus. You don't have to agree with Islam to recognize that as objective reality, okay? And also, with respect to Franklin Graham, he is was a very famous Christian activist within the United States, preacher. And you see how he kind of was hostile towards an Islamic expression, even at a private university, not even at a public university. And as I understand, Franklin Graham has had a ton of influence on American politicians. And so we should just recognize that private religious expression of Franklin Graham has definitely rubbed off on others. And how could that private religious expression actually intertwine itself with government expression? And so what I want to show you for the next video, and now this can be somewhat triggering for some people, is again, we have another form of private religious expression occurring off campus by some students, and you can see how it gets disrupted and how this just kind of reveals contending back and forth in our own society with forms of religious expression. So let's watch.
We're going to start tonight with some new calls for the North Texas Muslim community and from them for local leaders to get involved to condemn a verbal attack on a student Islamic group. And they were praying in a public park in Plano. Muslim leaders tonight believe that the very same person might be responsible for a similar disruption down in Austin. Our JD Miles tonight with the story and also the video.
It was here in Plano's Oak Point Park before dawn on a morning over the weekend, where a group of about 20 UTD Muslim students gathered for what they call a blessings breakfast, which included a prayer, a sacred moment for those who are Islamic.
It's our way of staying connected to our Creator.
It's very essential to our, mental health and our wellness.
Shema Zayan and Mustafa Carroll say that made what happened during the group prayer so troubling.
Destroy, rape, and pillage and murder.
A man unrelated to the group walked up and interrupted the silence.
You are going to go to hell unless you repent with them.
I wonder if anybody thinks that's Franklin Graham. Maybe that is Franklin Graham. What do you think? You saw his tweet, his post in the previous one, and now you see how this guy's acting. Now imagine if you're any good Christians, good Jews, any good religious person out there, and you were trying to host a private prayer group with your friends at a public park, and this is how people approached you. I mean, if this was occurring in Iran, I think people would talk about religious discrimination and things of that nature. Don't you think? So let's go ahead and finish it.
It was recorded on video launching into a verbal tirade against Islam. Muslims say it was unacceptable, regardless of anyone's religious beliefs.
I think it's outrageous. Could you imagine what would have happened if I went into a church or I saw a bunch of people praying, a Christian, Buddhist, or whatever, and I just started calling them names and telling them they were going to hell, et cetera, et cetera? What would the feeling be then?
The Muslim leaders we spoke with want to see Plano city leaders as well as police publicly condemn the behavior, as well as come up with safety measures to protect prayer gatherings in public places.
I'm very afraid that it's going to escalate into some type of violence. So we're asking for protection or help from law enforcement to curtail and to put a halt on much of this stuff.
The man involved in the Plano incident,
God wants to save all of you, but you're all evil and
is believed to be the same person who just 2 months ago interrupted an Islamic prayer service in Austin.
And now we see him in Dallas. So I wonder if someone is paying him to move from city to city to harass Muslims.
Plano police tell us they will look into the matter if and when a report is filed, which the Council on American Islamic Relations says will happen. In Plano, JD Miles, CBS News, Texas.
One other item of note, it is worth noting, CARE is currently accused by Texas officials of being a terrorist organization. CARE vehemently denies that allegation.
So what can we gather from that? Well, that is private religious expression occurring at, different locations, not really harming anybody. However, we have these, I guess, protesters of that is what you could call them, that have their own radical religious beliefs that involve shouting down others. And also, I think one of the points to make from just watching those videos, even though they're more sociological, is just to show you that there are certain personal religious beliefs that can come off as very hateful. And, quite frankly, when you read the language of Franklin Graham and then you hear the language of that guy shouting at them, what's the difference? And that's one of the fundamental, things to observe in this situation is how you have seemingly respectable people acting in such, horrible ways. Another quick thing I would like to show is just how, we also have to be mindful that, even in our own society, we do see a little bit more of moving towards, putting certain prayers in schools. And then there's the decision, well, what types of prayers will those be? What religions will they pay respect to? And these are very tough questions because, Christians in certain, parts of the country are not going to want to worship certain prayers that don't match their religious beliefs. And that applies to any religion, quite frankly, right? So I think it's very important that our society respects this, to be pluralistic. But let's go ahead and show some of the current political trends with respect to prayer in schools and why this relates to the First Amendment and public forums and things of that nature. So here's President Trump, actually, who is, at an evangelical conference here, stating that he wants more public prayer in schools.
And today I'm also pleased to announce that the Department of Education is officially issuing its new guidance to protect the right to prayer in our public schools. That's a big deal. Now, the Democrats will sue us, but we'll win it. Well, whatever. They'll sue us. They sue us for everything. I'm the most sued human being in history.
All right. And the only thing that we're getting from that is just to show that, there are religious groups within the United States that have influence on our elected politicians, and that, they would like to see more religion of a certain form being taught in schools. And how does that conflict with the First Amendment? So one of the things I also want to show on screen really quickly is, as you can see, the state of Texas very recently, and this article was published less than a week ago, Texas Education Board approves Bible stories as required reading in public schools. This just involves a Texas story where, politicians in Texas are seeking to have more Christian biblical teachings in U.S. classrooms. And how does that respect our Jewish and Muslim, Americans and things of that nature, and Hindu, Buddhism, all kinds of religions. We also have this. Now, this Oklahoma had previously tried to do a similar thing where they were going to have Bible instruction in schools. A new Oklahoma superintendent came in and he rescinded that mandate. But this essentially just reveals that not only is it the state of Texas, we've also had the state of Oklahoma and other states make political moves to see if they can get a certain religion taught in schools. And so let's hold on. I just want to pull up. I want to also pull up this. So we discussed Kennedy, right? And how the football coach was, he was expressing a quick, private religious expression and things of that nature. And it occurred in a lull in official duties. Well, I just want to show you some very extreme examples of how religion can involve itself in schools, and how this is very, bad for society in general. So let's just go ahead and play a few videos and give our thoughts. So in this video, we have an Iranian school principal's attempts at death to Israel chant fail hilariously. And this was a viral video of a high school principal in Iran trying to get his students to chant death to Israel and death to America. And the students instead replied death to Palestine. And so what you want to listen for is Marg Bar, and that means death to. And so you'll hear Marg Bar Israel, Marg Bar America, which is the death to Israel, death to America chant. But then the students reply Marg Bar Palestina, which is death to Palestine. And so that, this is like, this is like your school teacher in school trying to teach you fundamental principles of how to be a good person, right? And the students themselves are being contemptuous and making fun of the principal. So let's go ahead and watch how Iranians make fun of their own educators. Whoops. It seems to have frozen. Let's get it back online. 1 second, please. Technical difficulties. Oh, come on. 1 second, please. I'm just showing you kind of what's going on my screen. It's just all over the place. Here we go. We're back. All right. Oh my gosh. And just to be clear, like that, you hear them shouting Magbad Palestine, and like just to be clear, that could get every one of them killed. If the government authorities found that out, they would absolutely have the right to kill them, because that would be seen to be contrary towards government positions, and their government, according to their constitution, is representative of God itself. And so those types of chants and that type of setting, when a school teacher is telling you to chant that, that's a lot of social pressure we were discussing. And again, a lot of Iranians are facing conditions where they could be killed for this type of protest. And you see how they're laughing about it. And, you know, I quite frankly find it pretty inspiring, So eventually the high school principal gives up. And so I wonder if the way the Supreme Court would describe that, the conservative majority, is if they would call that a lull in official duties and a private personal expression of faith. That would be unbelievably blasphemous to one's own objective reasoning and anything of the like. And now, so that's my own critique of the conservative majority and how they're able to carve out these small little private moments in public settings, because who's to say the Iranians couldn't just, you know, manipulate that type of logic too, to say that's exactly what occurred there. And so we have to be mindful of those. Here's another one. And I just want to make a point very clear on, you know, telling children that, you know, about religion and things like that. You meet a lot of Iranian Americans who do describe, you know, religion influencing the government influencing religion, things of that nature, just a mutual thing. And it makes all of their lives worse. And one of the things that the government and religious leaders in, you know, Iran try to do, and how that would violate the First Amendment, is they try to brainwash kids in school. And it's a very common thing to hear from Iranians about, you know, you have to shout death to America, death to Israel, just to go in school. And just to show you, illustrate how common that is, here's a story of a woman. Just watch this.
We have been unable to go home to Iran for fear of arrest. When I was living in Iran as a child, the United States was portrayed as the enemy. At school, on television, in the curriculum, and every morning when we queued up before going to the classroom, we had to chant death to America. My mother was very independent. She had a career. She didn't wear the headscarf, but when the revolution...
So that is one example of one Iranian child. And this goes for men and women, right? I mean, here you're going to see a woman saying the exact same testimony, just being forced to shout death to America, death to Israel, because those are a lot of the religious beliefs that exist within Iran, very radical. And hey, democracy needs to defeat, you know, extreme religious radicalism. So check this out.
I tell you something, each and every Iranian after 1979, they're somehow politically affected. When they don't get a visa to travel, when they can't go to US because their country is listed as a terror organization, and the people are not the system, they're not the regime.
Tell us a little bit, explain us how the school system is for women in Iran. What was your personal experience? Why did you basically not fit into that system? Where was this moment you decided you have to leave?
See, they make the children, let's start from the school from 7, 8. They make you sing an anthem, for the Islamic Republic. And in a way, you have to chant it to America, that to Israel. So for
the children there in the school in the morning, instead of a prayer or something, you have to chant death to America, death to Israel. That's basically the school obligation.
Yeah. And they were always having the flag of Israel or America on the ground, and they're making you to walk on top of it.
That's kind of the school ritual in the morning. You have to trample over the American and Israeli flag.
Yes. And this is very, you know, when you're a child, you're just 7, 8 years old, you don't understand what you're doing, you know. This is the problem, that since you're at a school, they're raising you with their own system. And when I see that at times also, even in Austria, that there are people.
So as you can see, religious influence going on in public schools. Another one we got, as a child in school in Iran, 1979 and 1982, I was forced to chant death to Israel and death to America every morning during the school assembly. If one didn't chant, the other kids reported you for punishment, which was frequently physical. Not an easy thing for a Jewish 9-year-old, boy. And so what we gather from that is there is social pressure that goes on inside of the school where you do not conform yourself with the government religious expression, because really the government just wants everyone's own personal religious beliefs to be a certain viewpoint that conforms with the government's beliefs. And that is why we have separation of church and state, and we have the First Amendment, is to avoid this intense intertwining and radicalization of politics and religion. We have another
We've been
guy
talking
here.
a lot about.
So there was, generally speaking, a good perception about the United States. Now, after the revolution, the new regime, the Islamic Republic, really tried to brainwash the entire population, and especially the newer generation, against the United States. I grew up in Iran, and I had to, every single day before going to class, chant death to America before we could go and sit behind our benches. And yet, my brother was studying in the United States, and I couldn't really say death to America because I.
So the only reason I show that, and it definitely is a little bit political to show Iranian, stuff, and basically a class about American constitutional theory and the First Amendment. And so I will definitely concede that point. However, the illustrative point to make is this is what can occur when you allow religion to infiltrate the government so much that then government religious expression, forms, and that personal religious expression is actually suppressed. The government does not respect people's religious beliefs. And that is the society that results. And it usually starts in the schools and for children, the youth. So just pulling up another point on screen, we have to discuss also whose story counts. The hardest modern religious cases are not just about texts and tests. They are also about whose account of pressure, exclusion, neutrality, and public faith the court is willing to accept. Then we discuss why public religious expression feels existential. First things first, and this is kind of a difficult concept to talk about, but we need to discuss internal narratives. And what I mean by internal narratives is this. For many religious communities, visible public expression of faith is not incidental. It is bound up with identity, witness, and a self-understanding in which believers may see themselves as embattled or opposed by the surrounding culture. And then we also have a legal tension, which is when courts say a restriction is only when courts say a restriction is only institutional regulation and not religiously hostile, believers may experience that judgment as denial of their self-understanding rather than as a narrow doctrinal classification. And let's see, basically what I mean by this is whenever we think of internal narratives and some legal tensions, is within each religious tradition, there are internal narratives of embattlement. And we see this come up in Christian thought, Jewish thought, and Islamic thought. The way it would come up in these different faiths is this, is you see a lot of modern, we'll start with Judaism, right? And modern Israelis say that they're this tiny little nation supported by nobody. However, I do think they actually have a lot of support. It's just there's this idea of us versus them with certain, religious extremists that, exist. And so, that can also develop as there's an understanding as a group that we're under attack. And what you see also in Christian thought is, a lot of Christians believe that, Christ at the time he existed preached things that society and the authorities around him did not want to hear. And as a result, it ultimately led to his crucifixion and death. which proves his, being, to his followers and things like that. So there's a huge connection. But ultimately, the self-understanding was that to be a follower of Christ is to stand against what societal and other religious authorities may tell you. And, there is that understanding that, look, our Creator was crucified for preaching this to the world. And so if we preach this to the world, what do you think will happen to us? And so there is that internal belief within a lot of Christians that, to follow Christ is to be an embattled one in this world. And the same thing applies for Muslims. For Muslims, Muhammad himself was in Mecca and lived amongst pagans. And he, went to a cave. The angel of Gabriel spoke to him. And then he started to spread this version of what he believed monotheism was, and while all this, religion was corrupt. However, the story that a lot of Muslims understand is that by embracing Islam and, seeing himself as the prophet and professing all of this, that he was exiled from Mecca. Mecca is, the number one, the most holy site in Islam. But Muhammad himself, at the start of Islam, was banned from Mecca because he, of his own religious beliefs. And so he went to Medina and formed his local communities of the first Muslims in existence. And then eventually he led an army back from Medina into Mecca and conquered it. And ever since then, Mecca and Medina have both been Islamic. But one of the central themes that we get, even from Islam and that conception, is that Muhammad himself was embattled and he was spreading a certain truth, a religious truth that people around him did not want to hear, and that he was under attack. And so again, you can see this under attack mentality show up across the Abrahamic faiths, and also it shows up in different non-Abrahamic faiths as well. But I wanted to just give you a little bit of the mindset of that understanding. And then two, if you have courts that come out and say, look, we understand this happened to Jesus or to Muhammad or, for the state of Israel and its existence and things of that nature. But the problem is when you have these litigants come before a court and they give their stories of being persecuted or, subjugated and things of that nature, and the court doesn't seemingly affirm those narratives, it can really not comport with that group's or individual's own understanding of themselves. And that's why they may see the judicial system or legal system as adversarial to the group or individual itself. And so that is actually a lot of what I think the us versus them mentality, why it develops with respect to public religious expression, and why courts struggle to always be favorable with those groups. So how favoritism can enter through framing. So we have a conservative tendency. Conservative justices are often more receptive. Now, look, I know it says majority Christian, but quite frankly, you just take whatever legal system we're in, right? If we're in a majority Muslim country, we could exactly replace this with majority Muslim claimants. But, we're in the United States, which is majority Christian nation. And so we're just going to use conservative justice in that context, respectfully. So let's pull this up again on screen. Conservative justices are often more receptive when majority Christian claimants describe themselves as under siege, and that receptivity can shape how public religious acts are classified and protected. Then we also have the liberal tendency. Liberal justices are often more receptive to stories of exclusion, animus, or stigmatic harm affecting minorities, and may frame the same setting more strongly in terms of pressure on dissenters or vulnerable groups. And then we have a shared danger. Both sides can quietly validate some narratives of persecution or pressure while discounting others, all while speaking in the language of neutral constitutional doctrine. And so what I mean by that is this: no matter what nation we're in, we always have to evaluate what is, and again, people might say this is identity politics, but if you're going to be a lawyer and you're going to think smart, you have to, lick your finger, stick it in the wind and see what's going on, right? And one of the things that you should always do is evaluate the public. Okay, what's the majority religious opinion in this nation? And if it's Islamic, if it's Christian, if it's Jewish, you name it, if it's non-Abrahamic, Hindu. So conservative justices are going to be more receptive to those majority claimants that describe themselves as under siege. So whenever, if you're in a Hindu nation, right, and some Hindu walks into court, if you're a conservative justice, by virtue of maybe your own religious sympathies, there's a tendency for those justices to side more quickly with those claimants. And for more of our liberal justices in these types of societies, they may not be as instinctively willing to see the majority claimants that come in as actually being embattled or under siege. They may see them as more privileged, is how they would describe them. And liberal justices are going to tend to reserve the sympathy or favoritism arguments for those that are, non-privileged ones, so more minority groups. So if we're in like an Islamic country, certain liberal justices may, perceive, Jews and Christians or, non-Muslims as, maybe facing more problems than Muslim groups, but the conservative justices in those nations might not. And so this is very interesting because it requires a lot of thought with respect to identity politics and understanding how certain people, certain religious psychologies, I suppose, can still exist even within judges. So what I want to do now is go over a flipped public expression hypothetical. And so what I want everybody to do here is to put on your white old 1700s curler wig and channel your inner justice. And I want you to think about this. So here's the scenario. Imagine a Muslim public school coach in a majority Muslim city within the United States, let's say Dearborn, Michigan, who kneels after games for visible prayer at midfield. Some students join, some do not, and some parents allege subtle social pressure. Here's the question. Would judges and commentators instinctively describe the practice as private devotion in a public space, or a school-assisted religious activity carrying coercive pressure? The answer tests whether the doctrinal framework is being applied symmetrically. The point of the hypothetical is not that the cases are identical in every factual respect. It is to expose how quickly our judgments about neutrality, hostility, and pressure can shift when the religion and local majority changes. And so what I would do is this. Imagine the exact same Kennedy case that we had, and that's why I gave you this example. But rather than the football coach being a Christian and doing this midfield prayer that involved him, coaches, students, the parents, any of the other public, immediately after the game, still feeling the sweat running down your body, right? Your clothes still probably got sweat on them. And you do this prayer for everybody. Okay, well, if we substitute out Kennedy and we say, okay, Kennedy's no longer a Christian, Kennedy's actually a Muslim in this factual scenario, what would people think? Would they still be, oh, this is a private, small, little private act of free exercise of religion and within a more bigger public context? I'm very skeptical that people would have that framing. I actually think people would not want to see it that way. I think that maybe certain conservative Christian legal thinkers would try to come up with ways to see how Muslims are actually socially pressuring Christians in these communities to pray in the Muslim faith rather than the Christian faith. And so that's actually some of the problems I see with Kennedy, is it really doesn't successfully address the Muslim public school coach scenario, nor do I think the court actually wants to get into that. So public religious expression and equality logic. So an anti-classification instinct, which we've discussed in previous lectures, is, classification itself is wrongful constitutionally. And then we have the anti-subordination instinct, and anti-subordination says classification is okay so long as we're remedying historical injustices. So an anti-classification instinct would be this. One response is to demand the same formal rule for all religions if Christian and Muslim prayer are structurally similar. And that could include any Christian, Muslim, Jewish, not Hindu, you name it. The law should classify them the same way, regardless of local demography or social familiarity. And then we have an anti-subordination instinct. Another response is to ask who is actually pressured, excluded, or marked as an outsider in the setting at issue. That perspective attends more closely to hierarchy, vulnerability, and institutional power. As in Lecture 2, the deeper issue is not only what the legal test says, it is also what the court counts as neutrality, who it imagines as the victim, and which social narrative it permits to structure the doctrinal baseline. And so what we can basically draw from this is, do we not classify religious groups whatsoever, or do we recognize that they're historically marginalized religious groups and that we should maybe have different laws? I would probably find myself more in the anti-classification aspect, which ironically I feel like more conservative justices in this context might find themselves in the anti-subordination instinct. So the thesis of Lecture 3: the ambition of religion doctrine is to separate private liberty from unconstitutional establishment. The risk is that courts will use seemingly stable categories to ratify favored stories and discredit others. And what do we mean by that? Well, we have a stable doctrine and unstable stories. Here's the doctrinal aspiration. Religion doctrine presents itself as a neutral effort to distinguish private religious liberty from government establishment by using categories such as private expression, sponsorship, coercion, and neutrality. But here's the doctrinal risk. In practice, those same categories are contestable enough that judges can use them selectively, favoring some narratives of persecution or pressure while still appearing to apply an objective constitutional framework. Now let's go ahead and show the last side, and I'll provide my final thoughts. But here's the central takeaway. Lecture 1 showed how judges can manipulate meaning through framing and selective method. Lecture 2 showed how equality doctrine depends on unstable terms such as discrimination, neutrality, minority, and remedy. Lecture 3 adds that public religious expression is another domain in which broad constitutional language becomes doctrine through acts of classification, and in which courts can quietly validate some stories of persecution or pressure while discounting others. The larger lesson is not that one ideology alone bends doctrine. It is that constitutional reasoning is always vulnerable when categories that appear stable on paper are filled with social narratives that courts may apply selectively. And so overall, what we can gather is essentially whenever we see conservatives or liberal justices in this context of interpreting what is religious discrimination, hostility to religion, that can always be difficult to analyze, especially with respect to the Establishment Clause. So we're always going to have this competing, and I'm not sure we're really going to escape this. We're going to have competing interests with the free exercise of religion and the Establishment Clause. How far can the free exercise of religion go with certain public figures, maybe in their private context, before that crosses over into establishing religion by a government? Because again, as we discussed earlier, the schools are representative of the government. And who acts on behalf of the schools? The teachers, the instructors, the principals, for example. And when those individuals also are making certain benefits or punishments contingent on expressing certain religious expressions, is that actually a form of suppressing personal religious expression and actually installing government religious expression? I would argue it is. I actually think that, and I mean, this is more my own, I guess, personal philosophical religious beliefs, but look, it's up to all of us to have our own personal journey with finding our own religious beliefs. Whatever you come to, that's completely your business. However, it's also the business of each individual person and the government to mind its own and not to impose its own belief onto others. And so even where we have majority groups that may agree with each other, if they act in coordination through the government to try to change everybody else's personal religious beliefs, obviously that would violate the First Amendment, because that would be effectively establishing a religion. And as we saw, that's prohibited by the First Amendment. However, we have to also make sure that we should not be so sensitive in such a way that by stating nominally that we're advancing the establishments clause and trying to avoid the establishment of religion, how that can fundamentally effectuate hostility towards religion or discrimination. We could go into another lecture another time, but obviously during COVID we did the essential, non-essential, and people couldn't go to churches, but you could go to liquor stores, and people had a lot of problems with that type of analysis. And under the free exercise clause, free exercise of religion, and when you can regulate that. So I would love to hear what some of you have to think with respect to the competing interests of the free exercise of religion and the establishments clause. If you felt like I made any good points or points that could require further debate, I would appreciate that. And overall, if you enjoyed this lecture, please like and subscribe. I would very much appreciate that. And yes, please share this video also too with somebody that you think would find it interesting. And until next time, thank you very much.